For 512 years, the Aurelian Galactic Empire had expanded across the stars, and during those 5 centuries, entire civilizations had learned the same lesson. When the silver and black warships of the Empire appeared in their skies, surrender was usually the only choice that prevented destruction. The Empire was not the largest civilization in the galaxy by population, but it possessed the most disciplined military machine ever assembled, supported by thousands of industrial worlds, enormous shipyards, and a political system built around one unquestionable institution, the Galactic Throne. At the center of that system sat Emperor Valor IX, ruler of more than 11,000 inhabited worlds and supreme commander of the imperial military. The throne did not merely govern the empire. It represented the belief that expansion was necessary for survival. Every conquered civilization provided resources, territory, workers, technology, and strategic depth. Every retreat was therefore considered weakness, and every unexplored border was considered an unfinished duty. For generations, imperial commanders had been rewarded for advancing farther than their predecessors, and among those commanders, few had earned more respect than General Kale Veyron. Kale was not famous because he had won the largest battles. He was famous because he had rarely needed to fight them. He had ended the Orcs rebellion by convincing 3 enemy admirals to surrender before their fleets were destroyed. He had captured the fortress world of Varkani with fewer than half the ships his enemies possessed. During the Charon campaign, he had refused an order to bombard a civilian capital, choosing instead to surround it for 41 days until its government surrendered. His decisions had saved millions of lives, but they had also made him dangerous in the eyes of officers who believed mercy was a weakness. Kale understood war differently. He believed the purpose of a military campaign was not to destroy everything in front of it. The purpose was to achieve a political objective at the lowest possible cost. That philosophy had served him for 30 years. Then humanity appeared on the imperial frontier. Humans were not supposed to matter. They had only recently developed practical faster than light travel. Their colonies were scattered across a relatively small region of space, their fleets were modest, and their technology was considered inferior in almost every major category. They had no unified galactic government, no ancient military alliance, and no experience fighting a civilization remotely comparable to the Empire. When the Imperial Council first discussed humanity, most ministers expected a short campaign. 3 months, perhaps 6. The official plan was simple. Demand surrender, occupy Earth's primary shipyards, establish imperial administration, and move the frontier another 200 light-years outward. But Kale had been sent to observe humanity before the invasion began, and after 6 months on the frontier, he returned to the imperial capital with an expression none of his officers had seen before. Concern. His flagship, the Vindicator, entered the capital's orbital dock shortly after dawn. Imperial technicians surrounded the enormous warship as its damaged armor panels were inspected and its engines began emergency cooling procedures. Kale stepped onto the docking platform wearing the dark uniform of an imperial general. His silver-gray face showed no emotion, but the officers accompanying him looked exhausted. Lieutenant Saren, his second in command, followed closely behind. "General," Saren said quietly, "the medical officer wants you to undergo a full examination." Kale continued walking. "Later. You've been awake for 38 hours. Later." Saren hesitated before asking, "Are we really going straight to the throne?" Kale stopped. For several seconds he stared through the enormous docking window at the capital world below. The planet was covered with glowing cities, orbital elevators, shipyards, and immense structures that had taken generations to build. "Yes," he said. Immediately. Saren lowered his voice. "Is it that serious?" Kale finally looked at him. "You have served under me for 12 years. "Yes, General." "Have I ever returned from a reconnaissance mission early?" Saren thought about it. "No." "Have I ever requested an emergency audience with the Emperor?" "No." Kale turned toward the transport corridor. "Then you already know the answer." 20 minutes later, General Kale Veyron entered the hall of the Galactic Throne. The chamber was designed to make visitors feel insignificant. Its ceiling disappeared into darkness hundreds of meters above, while enormous banners hung from the walls, each representing a civilization conquered by the Empire. At the far end stood the Galactic Throne itself, suspended above a raised platform. Emperor Valor IX sat upon it, surrounded by 12 members of the Imperial Council. Among them was Lord Tarek, Minister of Expansion, a political leader who had never commanded a ship but had successfully turned military victories into political influence for nearly 2 decades. Tarek looked at Kale and smiled. General Veyron, I expected your report next week. Kale walked to the center of the chamber. The report can wait. Tarek's smile faded slightly. Emperor Valor leaned forward. You requested an emergency audience. Yes, Your Majesty. Then speak. Kale looked around the chamber. Every person present expected the same thing, another victory report. Instead, he said, I recommend that the Empire abandon its planned invasion of human space. Silence fell across the chamber. Tarek blinked. I beg your pardon? Kale repeated himself. Leave humanity alone. A few counselors exchanged amused looks. One of the admirals actually laughed. The Emperor did not. Explain, Valor said. Kale activated a projection from his wrist. A 3-dimensional map of the human frontier appeared above the floor. Humanity is technologically inferior to us, he began. Their fleets are smaller. Their shipyards are fewer. Their military command is fragmented between several governments. Their colonies are vulnerable, and their supply network is primitive. If we measure only conventional strength, they should be easy to defeat. Tarek folded his arms. That is what our intelligence reports concluded. Your intelligence reports are correct, Kale said. And still incomplete. He enlarged several human systems. I observed 23 engagements during my 6 months on the frontier. In 16 of them, human forces suffered tactical defeats. In 9, they lost more ships than we did. In 4, they abandoned entire installations without attempting to hold them. Tarek smiled. Then why are we having this discussion? Kale looked directly at him. Because you are measuring the wrong thing. The room became quiet again. Kale displayed recordings from the battles he had witnessed. This station was destroyed by our fleet, he said. The human defenders knew they could not survive. Yet they continued fighting for 9 hours. An image showed the station breaking apart under Imperial fire. Why? One counselor asked. To protect civilian transports escaping behind it. Kale changed the recording. This fleet was defeated near the Carina Passage. Instead of retreating toward its main base, the surviving ships scattered into dozens of smaller groups. Another image appeared. 3 weeks later, those groups began attacking our fuel convoys. Tarek shook his head. Piracy. No. Kale's voice hardened. Adaptation. He brought up another battle. We destroyed one of their defense networks. 14 days later, they rebuilt it using different communications protocols and altered weapon frequencies specifically designed to interfere with our shield systems. Admiral Soren frowned. They copied our technology? Not exactly. Kale paused. They studied the result of fighting us and changed their behavior. The Emperor watched the projection carefully. You are suggesting that humanity learns faster than our models predicted. I am suggesting something more dangerous. Kale dismissed the battlefield recordings. They are willing to lose today if losing today improves their chances tomorrow. Tarek laughed again. Every desperate civilization does that. Kale turned toward him. No, most desperate civilizations try to win the next battle. Humans are beginning to prepare for the next war. The chamber fell completely silent. Kale continued, Your Majesty, we can defeat their fleets. We can destroy their orbital stations. We can capture their colonies. But if we invade them, every battle will teach them something. Every defeat will force them to change. Every occupied world will create another resistance network. Their government is fragmented, but that may actually make them harder to break. If we destroy one command center, another will continue operating. If we destroy one shipyard, another will begin producing ships. If we occupy one world, the population can relocate and continue the fight elsewhere. The Emperor slowly stood from the throne. How long do you believe it would take us to defeat them? Kale hesitated. Militarily? Yes. Perhaps a year. Tarek smiled triumphantly. There, you have your answer. Kale looked at him. A year to defeat their organized military. The smile disappeared. Kale continued. I cannot tell you how long it would take to control them afterward. That sentence changed the atmosphere. The Emperor stepped down from the throne. You are asking the Empire to stop an expansion campaign because you believe humans may become difficult to govern. I am asking the Empire to avoid creating an enemy that does not need to defeat us to damage us. That sounds like fear. Kale's 4 eyes remained fixed on the Emperor. It is caution. Tarek stepped forward. Your Majesty, this is absurd. Humanity occupies a tiny corner of the frontier. We possess thousands of warships for every 100 they possess. Our industry is generations ahead of theirs. If we allow every minor civilization to frighten us into stopping expansion, the empire will cease to be an empire. Kale replied, and if we treat every warning as fear, eventually there will be no one left capable of warning us. The emperor stared at him for a long moment. Then he returned to the throne. General Veyron, you have served the empire honorably for 30 years. Yes, Your Majesty. You have won battles that others considered impossible. Yes, so I will assume that your recommendation comes from genuine concern. Kale said nothing, but the empire cannot halt its expansion because one general has developed doubts. Kale's expression tightened. These are not doubts. Then what are they? A warning. The emperor raised his hand. The projection vanished. Humanity will be given one final opportunity to surrender. If they refuse, Operation Quiet Hammer will begin. Kale looked toward the tactical officers. How large is the invasion force? Tarek answered proudly. 7,000 warships. Kale's face became still. 7,000? Enough to make resistance pointless. Kale looked back at the emperor. Your Majesty, I strongly advise against. Your advice has been heard. The emperor's voice became colder. The decision has been made. Kale stood motionless. He had spent 30 years learning when to argue and when to obey. This was the moment when obedience became dangerous. He lowered his head slightly. As you command. Then he turned and walked toward the massive doors. Just before leaving, he stopped. Without turning around, he said, when humanity realizes it cannot defeat us conventionally, it will stop trying to fight us conventionally. Nobody answered. Kale walked out. Behind him, the Galactic Council immediately began discussing fleet deployments, military objectives, and victory celebrations that had not yet happened. Outside the chamber, Kale entered the silent corridor alone. Lieutenant Saren was waiting for him. What did they say? Saren asked. Kale looked toward the stars visible through the enormous windows. They approved the invasion. Saren's face fell. All 7,000 ships? All of them. Then what do we do? Kale was silent for several seconds. Finally, he answered, we prepare for the war they refuse to understand. Far beyond Imperial space, on the blue planet called Earth, a warning signal arrived at the Human Defense Command. Admiral Daniel Cross stood alone in the operations room when the message appeared on his screen. He read it once, then again. The message contained only 12 words. Surrender to the Aurelian Empire or face total military enforcement. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. Outside the command center's reinforced windows, Earth continued turning peacefully beneath the morning sun. Millions of people were beginning another ordinary day, unaware that somewhere beyond their skies, 7,000 alien warships were preparing to enter their home. Daniel looked at the message for another few seconds before quietly saying, so they finally found us. He reached for the communications terminal. Wake the fleet. The order to wake the fleet changed everything on Earth within minutes. Across the human defense network, dormant military channels came alive. Reserve crews were summoned, orbital commanders were pulled from their homes, and civilian governments were informed that the warning they had feared for years had finally arrived. The Aurelian Galactic Empire was coming, and it was not sending a scouting force. It was sending thousands of warships. Admiral Daniel Cross remained in the command center as the first reports appeared across the tactical display. He had spent most of his career preparing for this moment, but preparation did not make the reality less frightening. The map showed Earth at the center of a blue defensive zone surrounded by hundreds of smaller human colonies. Beyond that zone was empty space, and somewhere inside that darkness, Imperial fleets were preparing their approach. Captain Lena Ortiz entered the command room carrying a tablet. Admiral, the governments are asking whether the invasion has actually begun. Daniel didn't look away from the display. Tell them yes. Some of them want authorization to launch everything. Daniel finally turned toward her. Everything? Every available warship. No. Ortiz frowned. No? If we launch everything at the first contact, we give the Empire exactly what it wants. She placed the tablet on the console. What does it want? Daniel pointed toward the map. A battle. Ortiz looked confused. Obviously. No. A decisive battle. They have 7,000 ships. We don't even have 700 combat-ready vessels across the entire defense network. If we put every ship into one formation, they can destroy us in a single engagement. Then what do we do? Daniel stared at Earth. We don't give them the battle they came for. The first Imperial fleet entered human space 9 hours later. It did not attack immediately. That was the part that disturbed Daniel most. The Imperial vessels emerged from hyperspace beyond the outer defense line in enormous formations, their silver and black hulls reflecting the distant light of stars. Thousands of ships appeared on human sensors, arranged with such precision that the formation looked less like a fleet and more like a moving wall. Imperial battleships occupied the center while cruisers formed protective layers around them. Behind the combat vessels came troop carriers, fuel ships, repair vessels, and logistical transports. Daniel watched the formation grow across the tactical display. How many? He asked. The sensor officer swallowed. Initial count is 2,800. Ortiz looked at him. That's just the first wave? Yes. Daniel slowly exhaled. Then they're serious. The Imperial fleet transmitted a final surrender demand. Every human government received the same message. This is General Kale Veyron of the Aurelian Imperial Fleet. By order of the Galactic Throne, all human military forces are instructed to stand down. Civilian populations are to remain in place. Resistance will be considered an act of rebellion against Imperial authority. Daniel listened to the transmission twice. Ortiz looked at him. That's Kale Veyron. I know. The general who warned them about us. Daniel nodded. Apparently his warning didn't stop them. Should we answer? Daniel considered it. Yes. He activated the communications channel. General Veyron, this is Admiral Daniel Cross of the Human Defense Command. You are requesting that we surrender our worlds, our governments, and our right to decide our own future. Kale's voice came through the bridge speakers. I am informing you of the Imperial position. Daniel replied, then inform your emperor that humanity will not surrender. There was a pause. Admiral Cross, Kale said, you do not understand the size of the force approaching you. Daniel looked at the enormous tactical display. I understand perfectly. Then you understand that you cannot win. Daniel's expression remained calm. Maybe not. Kale seemed surprised by the answer. Daniel continued, but winning isn't the only way to keep fighting. The transmission ended. Kale remained silent aboard the Vindicator. Lieutenant Saren looked at him. You knew they would refuse. Kale watched the human defensive network on his display. Yes. Then why did you bother asking? Because if they surrendered, millions might live. Saren hesitated. And now? Kale's eyes remained fixed on the distant human territory. Now I hope the Emperor was wrong. The first attack began at the outer system of Elysium. Elysium was not a major human world. It contained a small shipyard, several mining settlements, and approximately 400,000 civilians. Daniel had already ordered its evacuation 2 weeks earlier after intelligence detected Imperial preparations. But the evacuation had not been completed. Nearly 70,000 civilians remained. When Imperial ships entered the system, the local human commander requested immediate reinforcement. Daniel received the transmission while standing inside the operations center. How many ships? He asked. 42 combat vessels and 23 civilian transports. Ortiz checked the display. The Imperial fleet has over 600 ships in the system. Daniel's jaw tightened. Order Commander Hale to withdraw. He still has civilians. Then tell him to evacuate as many as possible and withdraw. Ortiz hesitated. He'll lose the shipyard. Yes. And the planet's defense network. Yes. Admiral, that's our entire position in Elysium. Daniel looked at her. I know. He opened the communication channel. Commander Hale, this is Cross. You are authorized to abandon the Elysium defense perimeter. Priority is civilian evacuation. Do not engage the Imperial fleet unless absolutely necessary. Commander Hale's tired voice answered. Sir, if we leave, they take everything. Daniel replied quietly, they are going to take it anyway. I need you to make sure they don't take the people. There was a long silence. Understood, Admiral. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. Imperial cruisers destroyed the outer defense platforms. Human fighters attempted to protect the evacuation corridor but were overwhelmed by superior numbers. 2 human destroyers were lost while shielding civilian transports from Imperial fire. The shipyard was captured intact. The Imperial banner rose above the orbital command station before sunset. It was a clear Imperial victory. But as the surviving human transports escaped into hyperspace, Kale studied the battle report with growing unease. How many civilians escaped? He asked. 320,000, his tactical officer replied. And military losses? 27 combat ships destroyed or disabled. Kale nodded. What did we capture? The officer checked the report. 1 shipyard, 4 mining facilities, 12 defense platforms, and several thousand tons of industrial material. Kale looked at the numbers. And what did we lose? 23 Imperial vessels damaged. 3 destroyed. Kale turned toward the viewport. Not enough. The officer frowned. General, the humans abandoned Elysium too quickly. They were defeated. No. Kale shook his head. They chose not to fight for it. That distinction mattered. On Earth, Daniel received the final Elysium report. He stood before the Strategic Council as officers displayed the losses. We lost 27 ships, one commander said. The shipyard is gone. Our outer defenses are gone. Another officer added, if we continue abandoning systems at this rate, we'll have nowhere left to retreat. Daniel looked at the map. We're not abandoning systems. The room went quiet. We're abandoning positions that cannot be defended efficiently. A senior commander frowned. That sounds like the same thing. Daniel shook his head. No. An abandoned system can be reclaimed. A destroyed fleet cannot. He highlighted the evacuation routes. Our people escaped. Our crews survived. Our mobile repair units survived. Our command network survived. Ortiz looked at him. But we're losing territory. Yes. The public will call that defeat. Daniel looked at her. They may be right. He paused. We did lose Elysium. The room became silent. Daniel did not try to disguise the truth. He knew morale could not be built on lies. But losing a battle doesn't mean we've lost the war. He turned toward the officers. From this moment onward, every commander receives the same priority. Protect civilians. Preserve ships. Preserve skilled crews. Preserve industrial knowledge. Do not sacrifice a fleet simply to keep a piece of ground the enemy can occupy tomorrow. One officer asked, what about Earth? Daniel looked at the blue planet on the central display. Earth is not moving. Far away, the Imperial victory at Elysium was celebrated throughout the Empire. News broadcasts described the operation as proof that humanity's resistance was collapsing. Lord Tarek stood before the Imperial Council and declared, the human frontier is already breaking. Within months, Earth will request terms. The Emperor listened with satisfaction. Only Kale remained silent. Later that evening, he entered a secure communications chamber aboard the Vindicator and reviewed the Elysium recordings again. He watched the human ships retreat. He watched the civilian transports escape. He watched the defense commander sacrifice 2 destroyers to protect vessels that carried no weapons. Kale replayed the final moments several times. Saren entered the room. You are still studying the battle. Kale nodded. Look at the evacuation corridor. Saren examined the recording. What am I looking for? Kale pointed to the tactical map. The humans knew our fleet would attack Elysium. Obviously. No. Look at the placement of their transports. Saren's eyes narrowed. They were already positioned outside the main engagement zone. Exactly. Kale enlarged the image. The evacuation routes were prepared before our fleet entered the system. Saren stared at him. They knew. They suspected. So what? Kale leaned back. So their defeat was partly planned. Saren looked shocked. You think they intentionally gave us Elysium? I think they understood that holding it would cost more than losing it. He turned toward the stars. And if I'm right, then the Emperor has just made the mistake I warned him about. Which is? Kale answered quietly, he believes every world we capture makes humanity weaker. Meanwhile, Daniel Cross stood inside a restricted planning chamber beneath the Human Defense Command. Around him were senior officers, engineers, intelligence specialists, and logistics commanders. The battle map of Elysium remained projected above the table. We cannot stop them from taking the frontier, Daniel said. Not yet. An engineer asked, then how do we stop them? Daniel studied the Imperial supply routes. We don't. The officers looked at him. We make them pay to keep what they take. The room fell silent. Daniel pointed toward the Imperial fleet's projected path. Every ship needs fuel. Every damaged cruiser needs repairs. Every occupied station needs personnel. Every colony needs security. The Empire has numbers, but numbers consume resources. Ortiz slowly understood. You want to attack their logistics. Daniel nodded. Not yet. Why not? Because we don't know enough. He looked at the battle recordings from Elysium. Our first defeat gave us something more valuable than territory. What? Daniel answered, information. He turned toward the officers. Let them advance. Outside, beyond the human frontier, hundreds of Imperial warships began moving toward their next targets. Humanity had lost its first major position. The Empire believed it had begun the final conquest of Earth. Neither side yet understood that the first battle had not decided the direction of the war. It had only revealed how both sides intended to fight it. For the next 3 weeks, the Aurelian Empire advanced deeper into human territory, and with every captured system, Imperial news networks announced another victory. Elysium had been followed by the fall of Meridian Station, then the occupation of the mining world Arctic, and finally the capture of the outer colony Vesta Prime. To the citizens of the Empire, the war appeared almost effortless. The mighty Imperial fleet moved from system to system while human forces retreated before it, abandoning installations rather than allowing themselves to be surrounded. Lord Tarek used the victories to strengthen his position inside the Galactic Council. Every morning, new maps appeared showing expanding Imperial territory, and every evening, Imperial commentators declared that humanity was approaching surrender. But inside the military command centers, the mood was different. General Kale Veyron had begun noticing a pattern that nobody in the Imperial Council wanted to discuss. The Empire was advancing, but the distance between its fleets and its supply bases was increasing. Every conquered station required fuel, repair crews, security personnel, communications equipment, and transport capacity. The human defenders were leaving behind little of value, but they were forcing the Empire to occupy everything it captured. One evening aboard the Vindicator, Lieutenant Saren entered Kale's command room carrying a stack of reports. General, 3 more supply convoys were delayed. Kale looked up from his tactical display. How long? Between 18 and 30 hours. Why? Human attacks. Kale studied him. How large? Small groups. 2 or 3 ships at a time. They strike a convoy and disappear. Kale leaned back. How many Imperial vessels have we lost? 8 transports, 4 escorts, and 1 repair ship this week. And how many human ships? Saren checked the report. 23. Kale nodded slowly. That is what worries me. Saren frowned. We're losing fewer ships than they are. Exactly. Kale turned toward the window. They're spending ships to make us spend time. Saren understood. They aren't trying to destroy the fleet. No, they're trying to slow it. Kale activated the regional map. Red Imperial territory stretched farther into human space while blue human territory contracted. Look at this. Saren approached the display. Every time we advance, the humans retreat. And every time we advance, our supply line becomes longer. Kale highlighted several Imperial transport routes. They don't need to stop us. They only need to make the journey expensive. Meanwhile, on Earth, Admiral Daniel Cross was standing in the same type of command room where he had watched Elysium fall. But the atmosphere had changed. His officers were no longer simply reacting to Imperial movements. They were studying them. A massive tactical display showed dozens of Imperial supply routes extending from captured systems toward the frontier. Daniel pointed toward one of the routes. How often does this convoy move? The logistics officer answered, every 6 days. Same route? Almost exactly. Daniel looked at Ortiz. That's careless. Ortiz nodded. Or confident. Daniel smiled faintly. Either way, we can use it. Their first attempt was deliberately small. 4 human attack ships waited near a remote navigation corridor. They did not attack the main Imperial fleet. They waited for a fuel convoy. When the convoy arrived, the human ships launched torpedoes, disabled 2 fuel carriers, destroyed 1 escort, and immediately withdrew. The entire engagement lasted less than 6 minutes. The human fleet lost 1 ship during the escape. The Empire lost 3 vessels and thousands of tons of fuel. Daniel received the report without celebration. Good, he said. Ortiz looked surprised. That's all? Yes. We just attacked an Imperial convoy. And they will change their route. Then what's the point? Daniel pointed toward the map. The point is that they now have to change their route. Ortiz stared at the display. You're trying to make every movement harder. Exactly. Daniel's strategy was not spectacular. There were no enormous victories, no Imperial battleships exploding by the dozen. Human ships attacked supply vessels, damaged communications relays, destroyed navigation beacons, and then disappeared. Sometimes the humans lost ships. Sometimes the attacks failed completely. In one operation, 6 human frigates attempted to intercept an Imperial convoy and were trapped by a cruiser group that arrived unexpectedly. 4 frigates were destroyed. 2 escaped with heavy damage. Daniel refused to call the operation a success. "We made a mistake," he told his officers afterward. "We underestimated their escort pattern." One commander asked, "Should we stop these operations?" Daniel shook his head. "No. We improved them." He looked at the casualty list. "If we stop every time something goes wrong, we will never learn." The Empire also learned. Imperial convoys began changing routes. Escorts became larger. Fuel ships traveled in unpredictable formations. The human attacks became harder. But that created another problem. Every additional escort ship protecting a supply convoy was one less ship available for frontline combat. Kale noticed it immediately. "They're forcing us to choose," he told Admiral Soren. "Choose what? Protection or conquest?" Soren frowned. "We have enough ships for both." Kale looked at the latest deployment figures. For now. The problem became more serious when the Imperial fleet reached the Carina Passage. The passage was strategically important because it connected several newly conquered systems to the deeper human frontier. The Empire intended to use it as a major supply corridor. Daniel knew that if the passage became secure, the Imperial advance would accelerate dramatically. So he ordered a limited operation. "We aren't going to defend Carina," Daniel told Ortiz. "We're going to make it inconvenient." Ortiz smiled. "That sounds like you." The human forces placed automated mines in several secondary routes, abandoned several decoy stations, and transmitted false navigation data suggesting that human fleets were massing near the main corridor. The Imperial commanders responded by diverting thousands of ships toward the supposed threat. There was no human fleet there. By the time the deception was discovered, 3 days had passed and millions of units of fuel had been consumed unnecessarily. Lord Tarek was furious. "How could our intelligence fail this badly?" he demanded during a military briefing. Kale answered carefully. "Because the humans are learning to manipulate our expectations." Tarek turned toward him. "Then destroy their intelligence network." "Which one?" Kale asked. "They have dozens." "Then destroy all of them." Kale's expression remained calm. "That is impossible." Tarek stepped closer. "You are the general who promised us this war would be difficult. Now that it is difficult, you seem remarkably pleased." Kale's eyes narrowed. "I am not pleased." "Then perhaps you should start producing victories instead of explanations." The meeting ended with Kale being formally ordered to accelerate the campaign. The order was impossible to misunderstand. The Emperor wanted a major victory. The Imperial Council wanted a major victory. Lord Tarek needed a major victory. And the military was now under pressure to create one. Kale knew what that meant. When politicians demanded speed from generals, generals began accepting risks that careful strategy would never permit. 3 days later, Imperial intelligence located the human colony of New Carthage. Unlike Elysium, New Carthage was heavily populated and contained one of humanity's most important civilian manufacturing networks. It was not a major military base, but Imperial intelligence estimated that destroying its industrial capacity would severely weaken human production. Tarek immediately approved an assault. Kale objected. "The colony is too deep inside our current supply network." Tarek replied, "That is why it matters. If we attack New Carthage, our fleet will move beyond the protection of the main logistics corridor. Then protect the corridor. With what ships?" Tarek's expression hardened. "General, are you refusing an order?" Kale paused. "No." "Good." The attack was authorized. On Earth, Daniel received the intelligence report only 12 hours before the Imperial fleet arrived. New Carthage contained nearly 9 million civilians. Daniel knew he could not save the colony's industrial infrastructure and protect the civilian population at the same time. He faced the hardest decision of the war so far. Ortiz entered the command room. "We have enough ships to make them pay." Daniel looked at her. "How many?" 130 combat vessels. "Against?" "Approximately 900 Imperial ships." Daniel shook his head. "We can't win. We don't have to win." Daniel looked at her. She was repeating his own philosophy back to him. "No," he said. "This time the difference is the civilians. If we engage, the Empire will bombard the cities while we're fighting." Ortiz went silent. Daniel stared at the colony map. "Begin evacuation." "Admiral, 9 million people." "I know. We may not have enough transports. Then use cargo ships. Some of them aren't designed for passengers. Then redesign them. And the military? Daniel took a slow breath. We stay long enough to make the evacuation possible. The Imperial fleet arrived 2 hours later. Human defense ships engaged the outer formation, not to defeat it but to force the Imperial commanders to deploy their fleet carefully. Civilian transports began leaving the planet. Imperial cruisers moved toward the surface. Daniel watched the evacuation counter rise. 2 million, 3 million, 4 million. Imperial fighters attacked the evacuation corridor. Human interceptors rushed to protect them. Ships exploded across the sky. 5 million evacuated, the operations officer announced. Daniel's hands tightened around the edge of the command console. Keep going. Enemy fleet approaching the northern cities. Redirect Squadron 7. They'll be trapped. I know. Squadron 7 entered the battle and lost 17 ships in less than 20 minutes. But the evacuation continued. 6 million, 7 million, 8 million. Then the Imperial fleet destroyed the primary spaceport. Daniel ordered the remaining transports to use secondary launch facilities. 8.4 million, the officer announced. Admiral, we had to go. Daniel looked at the final transport schedule. How many remain? 400,000. He stared at the burning planet below. We're not leaving yet. Sir, the fleet is collapsing. 400,000 people. Ortiz understood. We'll hold. The remaining human warships formed a defensive wall around the evacuation corridor. They knew they could not survive for long. One by one, their ships were destroyed. But the transports escaped. When the final civilian vessel entered hyperspace, Daniel gave the order to retreat. New Carthage fell. The Imperial Empire had captured another human world. But Kale watched the battle report in disbelief. How many civilians escaped? He asked. 8.6 million. Industrial facilities? Most destroyed or evacuated. Kale closed his eyes. So what did we gain? His officer hesitated. The colony. Kale looked at him. No, we gained a burned world. Back on Earth, Daniel stood before the Defense Council. The room was silent. Someone finally said, we lost New Carthage. Daniel nodded. Yes. And the Empire took the system. Yes. Then we lost. Daniel looked at the casualty report. Hundreds of human military personnel were dead. Dozens of ships were gone. Millions of civilians had been forced from their homes. We lost the colony, he said. I won't pretend otherwise. He paused. But the Empire wanted our industry. Instead, they received an evacuated population, destroyed factories, and another system they now have to occupy and defend. Ortiz asked, so what's next? Daniel looked at the expanding Imperial frontier. Now we find out how much an empire can carry before it becomes too heavy to move. Far away, Kale was asking himself the same question. But he was also looking at something else. The latest Imperial casualty report showed that the Empire had lost fewer ships than humanity, yet its fuel consumption had increased again. Maintenance delays were spreading, supply convoys required heavier escorts, and the human attacks were becoming more coordinated. Kale opened a private channel to the Imperial capital. Your Majesty, he said, I request permission to suspend the advance and consolidate our current territory. The Emperor's response arrived less than a minute later. Denied. Kale stared at the message. Then another transmission arrived from Lord Tarek. The throne expects a decisive victory. Kale slowly closed the channel. Outside the Vindicator, Imperial ships continued moving deeper into human space. The Empire believed it was tightening the noose around Earth. Kale now feared something else. The noose might already be tightening around the Empire itself. The fall of New Carthage changed the atmosphere inside the Aurelian Empire, but not in the way Lord Tarek had expected. Official broadcasts called it another glorious Imperial victory, showing images of silver warships entering orbit and Imperial banners rising above human installations. The destruction of the colony's industrial network was presented as proof that humanity's ability to resist was collapsing. Yet behind the closed doors of military command centers, officers were reading a very different set of numbers. The Empire had captured another world, but its supply requirements had increased again. More ships were needed to protect longer routes. More crews were needed to occupy captured facilities. More repair vessels were required because human attacks were becoming increasingly difficult to predict. General Kale Veyron sat alone aboard the Vindicator, studying the latest campaign reports. He had stopped believing that the Galactic Throne simply misunderstood the war. They were now choosing not to understand it. Lieutenant Saren entered quietly. "General, the capital has sent another directive." Kale did not look up. "Another advance order?" "Yes." Saren placed the transmission beside him. "They want the fleet to move toward the Helios corridor within 48 hours. Kale finally looked at the message. "How much fuel do we have?" "Enough for the advance." "And the return journey?" Saren hesitated. "If there are no delays." Kale stared at him. "There will be delays. I know." Kale stood and walked toward the tactical display. "What about the repair fleet?" 40% is still recovering from the Carina operations. "And the convoy escorts?" "Already stretched." Kale closed his eyes briefly. "They are asking us to move faster while our logistics are slowing down." Saren looked at the map. "Perhaps the humans are closer to collapse than we think." Kale turned toward him. "What makes you believe that?" "They keep losing territory." "That isn't an answer." Saren was silent. Kale pointed toward the frontier. "They have lost Elysium. They lost Arcton. They lost Vesta Prime. They lost New Carthage. What have they not lost?" Saren studied the map. "Their fleet." "Exactly." Kale highlighted the human industrial zones. "Their mobile shipyards are still operating. Their command network is still functioning. Their population has been redistributed. Their attacks on our supply lines are increasing. They are losing territory, but their ability to resist is not collapsing at the same rate." Saren looked troubled. "Then what happens if the Emperor keeps pushing?" Kale's voice became quiet. "Eventually, we reach the point where retreat becomes more dangerous than advance." The next morning, Kale requested another audience with Emperor Valor. This time he was not accompanied by officers. He entered the throne chamber alone and found the Emperor surrounded by ministers and admirals. Lord Tarek was already waiting. "General Veyron," Tarek said, "I assume this is about the Helios offensive." "It is." Kale faced the Emperor. "Your Majesty, I recommend suspending the offensive." Tarek immediately interrupted. "Again?" Kale ignored him. "Our supply network is no longer supporting the rate of advance. Human attacks have forced us to increase convoy protection, and our repair fleets are operating beyond safe capacity." The Emperor looked toward the military advisors. "Is this accurate?" One admiral hesitated. "The logistical strain is significant." Tarek turned toward him. "Significant is not critical." Kale replied, "It will become critical if we continue." Tarek stepped forward. "General, we have captured nearly a quarter of the human frontier. And how many of those systems can we actually use?" "All of them." "Then why are our supply routes becoming longer?" Tarek's expression hardened. "Because war requires resources." "Exactly." Kale looked toward the Emperor. "And we are spending more resources to hold territory that provides us less value than expected." Valor remained silent. Kale continued, "Your Majesty, the humans are deliberately giving us ground." Tarek laughed. "You have said that before." "Because it remains true." Kale brought up a projection. "Look at their population movements. Every time we capture a colony, most of its population has already been evacuated. Every time we seize an industrial center, critical equipment has been dismantled or relocated. They are sacrificing geography to preserve people and production." The Emperor studied the display. "How certain are you?" 87%. Tarek shook his head. "And the remaining 13%? Kale looked at him. "Enough to make caution reasonable." Tarek stepped closer. "No. Enough to make you afraid." Kale's expression hardened. "You keep confusing caution with fear. Because you keep recommending retreat. I am recommending consolidation, which is retreat under another name." The Emperor finally raised his hand. "Enough." The chamber fell silent. Valor looked at Kale. "How long would you suspend the advance?" 30 days. Tarek immediately objected. 30 days would give humanity time to rebuild. Kale replied, "That is precisely why we need to understand what they are rebuilding." The Emperor thought for several seconds. Then he shook his head. "Denied." Kale's jaw tightened. "Your Majesty, the offensive continues." Kale stood perfectly still. "Understood." As he turned away, Tarek smiled. "You should learn to accept victory when it arrives, General." Kale stopped at the chamber doors. "Victory isn't what concerns me anymore." "Then what does?" Kale looked back. "What happens after it?" He left. 2 hours later, Kale received something he had not expected. An encrypted Imperial report marked for senior command only. He opened it inside his private quarters. The report contained actual logistical figures that had never been included in the public military summaries. Fuel reserves were lower than reported. Maintenance failures were significantly higher. Human attacks had destroyed more supply vessels than the official numbers suggested. Kale read the report twice. Then he noticed something worse. Several pages had been altered before reaching the Galactic throne. Someone was deliberately hiding the scale of the problem. Kale immediately contacted the Imperial Logistics Directorate. "I need the original Helios fuel projections." The officer on the other end hesitated. "General, those records are restricted. I am a fleet commander. Your authorization has been reduced." Kale stared at the screen. "By whom?" Silence. Then the connection terminated. Kale understood. Someone inside the Imperial government was not merely ignoring his warnings. They were actively preventing him from obtaining information. He began investigating quietly. Within 48 hours, he discovered that Lord Tariq's office had modified multiple campaign reports before they reached the Emperor. Casualty figures had been reduced. Supply losses had been classified as temporary. Human attacks had been described as isolated incidents rather than coordinated operations. Kale stared at the evidence. "He's hiding the war from the throne," Saren said. Kale nodded. "No. He's hiding the truth from the throne." Saren looked uneasy. "Why?" "Because the moment the Emperor admits this campaign is becoming expensive, Tariq loses the political argument that made him powerful. Then expose him." Kale looked toward the door. "And who do you think will believe me?" Before Saren could answer, the Vindicator's security system activated. Red warning lights filled the corridor. Imperial security officers entered the command deck. Their commander raised a document. "General Kale Veyron, by authority of the Galactic Throne, you are ordered to surrender command." Saren immediately stepped forward. "On what grounds?" "Unauthorized access to restricted information and interference with Imperial operational policy." Kale looked at the officer. "Who signed the order?" The officer handed him the document. The signature belonged to Emperor Vaylor. Kale read it carefully. Then he looked at Saren. "Stand down." Saren stared at him. "General, stand down." The officers approached. Kale surrendered his command without resistance. But before leaving the bridge, he quietly activated a private terminal and entered a short sequence. Saren noticed. "What did you do?" Kale whispered. "Nothing you need to know." He was taken to a detention chamber beneath the Vindicator. For the first time in 30 years, General Kale Veyron was a prisoner of his own empire. But he had not become a prisoner because he had lost a battle. He had become a prisoner because he had discovered that the people directing the war no longer wanted accurate information. 12 hours later, the Imperial fleet resumed its advance toward Helios. Kale sat alone in detention, listening to the distant vibration of engines. He knew the fleet was moving into a region where its supply network was dangerously thin. He also knew the humans would notice. Across the frontier, Daniel Cross received an unusual intelligence signal. It was heavily encrypted and contained almost no information. Only a short sequence of numbers appeared. Daniel frowned. "Where did this come from?" The intelligence officer replied, "Imperial Military Network." "Can we identify the sender?" "Not yet." Daniel looked at the numbers again. They matched the timing intervals of Imperial fuel convoys. Ortiz stepped closer. "Could be a trap." "Yes." "Then why are you interested?" Daniel stared at the screen. "Because whoever sent it knew something our intelligence service couldn't possibly know." He ordered the information to be isolated and analyzed. The human intelligence team spent hours comparing the numbers against intercepted Imperial traffic. Eventually, one analyst looked up. "Admiral." Daniel turned. "What? These aren't coordinates." "Then what are they?" "Fuel consumption records." Daniel's expression changed. "Can you verify them?" "We've checked them against 6 separate convoy movements." The analyst swallowed. "They're accurate." Ortiz looked at Daniel. "Who sent them?" The analyst shook her head. "We don't know." Daniel stared at the numbers. "Someone inside the Empire is helping us." "Why?" "I don't know." Daniel stood. "Find out." The answer came 2 days later. The encryption signature belonged to General Kale Veyron. Daniel read the confirmation in silence. Ortiz crossed her arms. "The general who told us to surrender?" "Yes." "The same general who warned his emperor about us?" "Yes. And now he's giving us Imperial logistics data." Daniel looked toward the stars. Either he's trying to save his career, Ortiz finished, or he's trying to save us. Daniel shook his head. Maybe both. They did not immediately trust Kale. Instead, Daniel ordered a controlled test. Human ships were sent toward a remote Imperial convoy route identified by the data. They did not attack. They observed. The convoy arrived precisely where Kale's information predicted. Then another convoy followed the same pattern. The data was real. Daniel finally opened a secure communication channel. General Veyron, he said, if you can hear this, understand that we do not trust you. There was no response. Daniel continued, but we are listening. Several seconds passed. Then a faint signal appeared. Kale's voice emerged through heavy interference. Admiral Cross. Daniel froze. You know who I am. I have studied your defensive operations. Then you know I don't surrender easily. Yes. Kale's voice sounded tired. That's why I contacted you. Daniel looked at Ortiz. Why? Kale answered, because my government has stopped listening to me. Daniel remained silent. What do you want? He finally asked. Kale's response was almost a whisper. I want you to survive long enough to prove me right. The signal abruptly disappeared. Daniel stared at the dead communication channel. Ortiz asked, do we trust him? Daniel shook his head. Not yet. Then what do we do? Daniel looked at the Imperial supply routes. We verify everything he gives us. He paused. And if it keeps being true? Ortiz waited. Daniel finished. Then we may have just found the one person inside the Empire who understands what this war is becoming. Back aboard the Vindicator, Kale sat in darkness as the ship carried him deeper into Imperial territory under guard. He had taken the first step that could never be undone. He had warned the enemy. He knew what the Empire would call it if they discovered the truth. Treason. But as the distant stars passed beyond the viewport, Kale realized something that frightened him more than his own execution. If humanity failed, his betrayal would accomplish nothing. And if humanity survived, the galactic throne would eventually have to answer one question. Why had the general they trusted most been forced to become a traitor just to make them listen? The Imperial fleet reached the Helios corridor 11 days after General Kale Veyron had been arrested, and by then the campaign had changed from a carefully planned invasion into something far more dangerous. The Empire still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, but its enormous fleet was beginning to feel the consequences of moving through hostile territory without secure logistics. Fuel convoys were arriving late. Repair ships were working around the clock. Human attacks continued striking isolated transports, communication relays, and navigation stations, never staying long enough to be trapped. The Empire still won most direct engagements, but each victory seemed to require more effort than the last. On Earth, Admiral Daniel Cross understood that humanity had reached the point where retreat alone would no longer be enough. The Imperial fleet was now close enough to threaten the inner defense systems, and if Helios fell, the next major defensive corridor would be the Sol approach. Daniel stood before the command council as the strategic map filled the room. We have three choices, he said. Captain Lena Ortiz crossed her arms. I already know the first two. Daniel nodded. We retreat farther, we fight them head-on, or we make the Helios corridor too expensive to cross. A senior commander looked at the enormous Imperial fleet projection. We can't fight that, correct? And if we retreat again? Daniel pointed toward Earth. Then they arrive here. The room became silent. Ortiz studied the map. So we make them pay. Daniel nodded. But this time, we're not just attacking their supply ships. We're going after the system that keeps the fleet moving. The plan was dangerous because it required coordination across hundreds of human vessels, civilian networks, and hidden bases. Humanity did not have enough ships to destroy the Imperial fleet. Instead, Daniel divided the remaining forces into small task groups. Some would attack fuel convoys. Others would sabotage repair stations. Several would create false signals to force Imperial ships away from their intended routes. A few would deliberately reveal themselves and then retreat, drawing Imperial warships toward empty sectors. None of the individual operations could win the war. Together, Daniel hoped, they could slow the Empire enough to change the balance. What happens if one group gets trapped? Ortiz asked. Daniel answered honestly. They die. And if 3 groups get trapped? Then we learn faster. Ortiz stared at him. You really are willing to risk that many ships? Daniel looked at the casualty reports from the previous month. No. I'm willing to risk ships because the alternative is risking Earth. The first phase began at the edge of Helios. A human strike group attacked an Imperial fuel convoy and destroyed 4 tankers before withdrawing. An hour later, another human group attacked a communications relay. 6 hours after that, a third force appeared near an Imperial repair station. The Imperial commanders responded exactly as Daniel predicted. They began redirecting escorts toward every reported human contact. But the human ships kept disappearing. The Imperial fleet was forced to spread out. General Soren, now commanding the forward Imperial forces, was furious. "They are everywhere," he told his staff. "No, General," his intelligence officer replied. "They are making us think they are everywhere." Soren stared at the tactical display. "Then find the real fleet." The intelligence officer hesitated. "We believe the main human force is near Helios Prime." Soren turned sharply. "How certain?" 60%. That's not enough. The alternative is that the humans are deliberately feeding us false information. Soren looked toward the stars. "Then we need to force them to reveal themselves." The Imperial fleet launched a major assault on Helios Prime. Daniel knew immediately that this was the moment he had been waiting for. "They're taking the bait," Ortiz said. Daniel shook his head. "They're taking the only road we left open." The human defense fleet withdrew from the outer system exactly as Imperial forces arrived. Imperial commanders interpreted the retreat as evidence that the human defenses were collapsing. Thousands of Imperial ships entered the system. But Helios Prime had been prepared. Civilian populations had already been evacuated. Fuel reserves had been removed. Industrial equipment had been dismantled. The planet's major orbital stations had been stripped of anything valuable. The Imperial fleet captured the system, but once again, it captured an empty shell. Soren received the report and slammed his hand against the command console. "Where is their fleet?" His intelligence officer answered, "Unknown." "Where are their supplies?" "Mostly evacuated." "Their command centers?" "Relocated." Soren stared at the display. "Then what exactly did we conquer?" No one answered. At that moment, the next stage of Daniel's plan began. Human ships attacked the Imperial supply corridor behind Helios Prime. This time they did not retreat immediately. They struck one convoy, withdrew, then attacked another convoy farther along the route. Imperial escorts chased them. The humans disappeared into a debris field and emerged on the opposite side. 3 Imperial cruisers were damaged. 2 human frigates were lost. But the convoy system became increasingly disorganized. Kale, still imprisoned aboard the Vindicator, watched the reports through a restricted military channel. He immediately recognized the pattern. "They are compressing the logistics network," he whispered. Saren, who had secretly remained loyal to him, had been assigned to the detention ship as a guard. He looked at Kale through the observation window. "What does that mean?" Kale answered, "They're forcing the Empire to spend ships protecting supplies instead of attacking targets." "Can the fleet survive that?" Kale paused. "For a while. And after that? It depends on how long the war lasts." Saren lowered his voice. "Then humanity is trying to make the war last." Kale looked at him. "Yes. And the Empire? Is trying to make it end quickly." Saren understood. "So whoever controls the pace controls the war." Kale nodded. "Now you understand." The Imperial command eventually realized that the Helios campaign was consuming too many resources. Soren requested permission to consolidate, but Lord Tarek rejected the request. "The human fleet is weakened," Tarek declared. "Continue the advance." Soren replied, "We have insufficient fuel reserves for a deep operation." Tarek answered, "Then take fuel from captured worlds." Soren's voice became colder. "Those worlds have already been stripped." Tarek said nothing. The conversation ended. The next Imperial offensive began anyway. This time, more than 4,000 warships advanced toward the Sol approach. It was the largest Imperial force humanity had ever faced. When the fleet appeared on long-range sensors, the human command center went silent. Ortiz stared at the display. "That's not a fleet." Daniel watched the thousands of enemy vessels forming across the darkness. "No. Then what is it?" Daniel answered, "A message." The Imperial fleet transmitted a final demand. Humanity is ordered to surrender all military authority and accept Imperial governance. Resistance will result in the destruction of remaining defensive infrastructure. Daniel listened without responding. Ortiz asked, "Are we going to answer?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." He opened the channel. "To the commander of the Aurelian fleet, this is Admiral Daniel Cross." You have crossed thousands of light years to conquer a species you believed would surrender. He paused. We have lost worlds. We have lost ships. We have lost people. We will probably lose more before this ends. The Imperial commander replied, then surrender and end the suffering. Daniel looked at Earth behind him on the massive display. That's the difference between us. You believe suffering makes surrender inevitable. We believe suffering makes survival necessary. He closed the channel. The battle began 2 hours later. The first Imperial wave overwhelmed the outer defense stations. Human ships fired from concealed positions and retreated before the larger formations could surround them. Imperial battleships advanced through the defensive corridor while smaller human vessels attacked from the sides. The human strategy worked for several hours, but not perfectly. 3 defensive groups were trapped. 2 were destroyed completely. The third escaped with only 7 ships. Daniel received the report while directing the battle. Group 12 is gone, Ortiz said quietly. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Mark them as lost. We could have sent reinforcements. And lost another group. Ortiz looked at him. Sometimes I hate this war. Daniel answered, so do I. Then he looked back at the display. That's why we had to end it. The Imperial fleet continued forward. Earth was still hours away from direct attack range, but the defensive corridor was collapsing. Daniel ordered the final phase. Human ships stopped attacking the Imperial fleet and instead targeted the fuel reserves that had followed the main formation. The Imperial commanders realized the trap too late. Their fleet had moved deep into human space with thousands of warships, but the logistical vessels behind them were now under attack from dozens of small human groups. Imperial escorts turned around to protect the supplies. That slowed the advance. More escorts turned back. The enormous fleet began losing its perfect formation. Daniel watched the tactical display change. Now, he said, human ships launched concentrated strikes against the most isolated fuel vessels. Explosions spread through the rear of the Imperial formation. One fuel carrier after another disappeared. Imperial cruisers moved to protect them, but human forces withdrew before they could be engaged. The battle continued for 6 more hours. Neither side achieved a decisive victory. Humanity lost hundreds of ships. The Empire lost fewer, but its fuel reserves were falling dangerously low. Then the Imperial flagship received an emergency report. General Soren, the third fuel reserve has been destroyed. Soren stared at the display. How much remains? 31%. And distance to the nearest secure supply station? 4 days. Soren looked at the battlefield. How long can the fleet operate? The logistics officer hesitated. If we continue combat operations? Yes. Less than 40 hours. Soren understood the meaning immediately. The fleet could continue fighting, or it could continue moving, but it could not do both indefinitely. He contacted Lord Tarek. We must withdraw. Tarek's response was immediate. Absolutely not. Our fuel reserves are critical. The humans are nearly defeated. Soren looked at the battlefield. No. They are nearly exhausted. There is a difference. Tarek became angry. You have 4,000 ships. Soren answered, and those ships require fuel. The channel went silent. Then Tarek said, the throne expects victory. Soren replied, then tell the throne to send fuel. The communication ended. On Earth, Daniel received confirmation that the Imperial fleet was slowing. Ortiz stared at the display. They're pulling back. Daniel didn't celebrate. Not yet. But they're retreating. They're withdrawing because they have to, not because we've defeated them. He looked at the casualty reports. Our fleet is exhausted too. The Imperial fleet began its withdrawal before dawn. Human ships followed at a distance but did not pursue aggressively. Daniel refused to turn a strategic success into a reckless battle. The Empire had not been destroyed. Humanity had not won the war. But for the first time since the invasion began, the Imperial fleet was moving away from Earth. On the Vindicator, Kale watched the retreat order appear on his screen. He stared at it for several seconds. Saren looked at him. They withdrew. Kale nodded. Yes, you were right. Kale shook his head. No. Saren looked confused. No? Kale looked toward the distant Earth glowing blue against the darkness. I warned them this would happen. I didn't want to be right. He turned away from the display. Because now the Empire has suffered its first strategic defeat. Saren asked, what happens next? Kale's expression became grim. The throne will blame someone. And far away in the galactic capital, Emperor Valor IX received the official report. The Imperial fleet had not been destroyed. Earth had not been captured. The losses were described as acceptable. But the Emperor noticed one sentence that had not appeared in any public broadcast. The Imperial fleet has withdrawn from the Sol approach. He looked at Lord Tarek. Explain this. Tarek opened his mouth, but for the first time since the war began, he had no immediate answer. The Emperor looked again at the report. Somewhere inside the Empire, General Kale Veyron was still a prisoner. Somewhere beyond the frontier, humanity was still wounded and exhausted. And between them stood an empire that had finally discovered the truth Kale had tried to explain months earlier. Overwhelming military strength meant very little when every mile of conquest made the war harder to sustain. The Imperial fleet returned from the Sol approach in silence, and for the first time in centuries, the banners of the Aurelian Empire did not represent an unstoppable advance. The warships were damaged, exhausted, and low on supplies. Crews had spent weeks fighting without proper rest, repair vessels were operating beyond capacity, and thousands of Imperial soldiers had been left behind on worlds that were no longer strategically useful. Yet the greatest damage was not visible on the hulls of the ships. It was inside the Galactic throne itself. Emperor Valor IX sat in the throne chamber while the senior military commanders presented their reports. Lord Tarek stood beside them, pale but composed. The fleet remains operational, one admiral reported. Losses are within acceptable limits. The Emperor looked at him. And the objective? The admiral hesitated. Earth remains unconquered. Silence filled the chamber. Valor turned toward Tarek. You told me the human resistance was collapsing. Tarek lowered his head slightly. The resistance suffered significant losses. That was not my question. Tarek swallowed. Earth remains unconquered. The Emperor rose from the throne. How many worlds have we captured? 43 major systems and 71 minor installations. How many are producing resources for us? Another silence. 21 major systems are currently contributing. How many require more resources to occupy than they provide? The Admiral looked toward Tarek. 29. The Emperor's expression changed. For months, he had listened to reports describing victory after victory. Now the numbers told a different story. The Empire had conquered more territory than it could efficiently use. Lord Tarek tried to recover control of the conversation. Your Majesty, the situation can still be corrected. We need only another major offensive. Emperor Valor looked at him. With what fuel? Tarek hesitated. The reserves can be rebuilt. With what ships? The shipyards are producing replacements. With what crews? Tarek had no answer. The Emperor turned toward the military commanders. Where is General Veyron? One admiral answered, still under detention. Valor stared at him. Bring him here. An hour later, Kale was escorted into the throne chamber wearing the same uniform he had worn when he first warned the Emperor. But the insignia of command had been removed from his chest. His hands were not restrained, yet 2 Imperial guards stood behind him. He looked around the chamber and noticed something immediately. Nobody was celebrating. The Emperor looked older than he had several months earlier. General Veyron, Valor said. Your warnings were accurate. Kale remained silent. I said your warnings were accurate. Kale nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. You could have told me again. Kale looked directly at him. I did. The Emperor's expression tightened. You could have been more persuasive. Kale's voice remained calm. I stood in this chamber and asked you to leave humanity alone. I showed you the evidence. I explained the risks. I asked for 30 days to consolidate our territory. You refused. The Emperor looked away. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally he asked, can the Empire still win? Kale considered the question carefully. Define win. Destroy the human military. Yes. Capture Earth? Kale paused. Eventually, perhaps. Then why are you speaking as though we have already lost? Kale shook his head. Because destroying humanity is not the same as winning a war against humanity. The Emperor frowned. Explain. Kale stepped toward the central map. We can capture Earth. We can destroy their fleets. We can occupy their cities. But what happens afterward? We would need to station millions of troops across thousands of settlements. We would need to rebuild their industries while suppressing resistance. We would need to protect enormous supply lines for decades. And every human child born under occupation would grow up knowing that an alien empire conquered their home. He looked toward the Emperor. You wouldn't be ending a war. You would be inheriting one. The Emperor lowered his eyes. Lord Tarek suddenly stepped forward. Your Majesty, this is defeatism. Humanity is exhausted. Their fleet is shattered. This is exactly the moment to strike. Kale turned toward him. How many human ships did we destroy at the Sol approach? Tarek answered quickly, hundreds. How many Imperial ships did we lose? Tarek hesitated. Several hundred. And how many human shipyards remain? Tarek said nothing. Kale continued, 32 major production facilities. 24 mobile construction yards. Their military command network remains intact. Their civilian population remains distributed across thousands of settlements. You keep counting destroyed ships while ignoring the factories building replacements. Tarek's face hardened. You are deliberately undermining the Empire. Kale replied, I am describing reality. The Emperor looked at the two men. Then he asked, what would you do? Kale answered immediately. Stop. Withdraw? Yes. Tarek almost laughed. After everything we have sacrificed? Kale looked at him. Exactly because of everything we have sacrificed. The Emperor walked toward the enormous window overlooking the capital world. And humanity? Kale said, they will not trust us. Would you? No. Then why would they agree to peace? Kale thought for a moment. Because they are exhausted too. The Emperor remained silent. Kale continued, humanity doesn't need to conquer us. They only need to survive. We don't need to destroy them. We only need to stop trying to own them. The words remained in the chamber long after he finished speaking. Finally, Emperor Valor turned around. What about the captured territories? Kale answered, some will have to be returned. Others can become neutral zones. We negotiate. Tarek stepped forward. Your Majesty, you cannot surrender imperial territory to humans. The Emperor looked at him. Perhaps. Then he looked at the military reports. But I can stop spending imperial lives to hold territory that has already cost us more than it is worth. The peace decision did not happen overnight. It took 6 weeks of negotiations, arguments, military assessments, and political resistance. Hardliners inside the empire demanded another offensive. Human governments demanded reparations and the withdrawal of imperial troops. Several human colonies refused to trust any imperial promise. Some imperial commanders argued that withdrawal would encourage rebellion across the galaxy. Daniel Cross faced similar pressure on Earth. When the proposal reached the Human Defense Command, Ortiz read it twice. They want to withdraw. Daniel nodded. From 43 major systems. Yes. And return several colonies. Yes. Ortiz looked suspicious. What's the trap? Daniel answered, there may not be one. You believe that? Daniel looked toward Earth. I believe they're finally tired. But Daniel refused to declare victory. Humanity had suffered too much. Millions had been displaced. Thousands of military personnel were dead. Entire colonies had been destroyed or abandoned. Economies were damaged, families were separated, and the military fleet that remained was a fraction of what it had been before the invasion. In a broadcast to the human population, Daniel said, we survived. That is the truth. But survival does not erase what we lost. We should not pretend that this war was easy or that we destroyed the empire. We did not. We endured long enough for the empire to realize that conquering us would cost more than it could justify. On the imperial side, Lord Tarek's influence collapsed when the original campaign reports were released. Investigators discovered that logistical losses had been hidden and battlefield reports had been altered. The Emperor removed him from the council and ordered a full investigation. But Kale's situation was more complicated. The Emperor summoned him privately one final time. The throne chamber was empty except for the two of them. General, Valor said, I owe you an apology. Kale looked surprised. Your Majesty? You warned me. I ignored you. Kale lowered his eyes. I served the Empire. Even when you knew the Empire was wrong. Kale looked up. Especially then. The Emperor walked toward him. You betrayed me. Kale did not deny it. Yes. You sent information to humanity. Yes. You could have been executed. I knew. The Emperor stared at him. Why did you do it? Kale answered quietly, because I believed the Empire was making a mistake that would cost millions of lives. Valor looked toward the window. And now? Kale replied, now I believe we have a chance to prevent the next war. The Emperor asked, do you still serve me? Kale thought for a moment. I serve the people of the Empire. The Emperor almost smiled. That is not the answer a throne expects. Kale replied, perhaps that is the problem. The Emperor restored Kale's rank, but Kale refused his old command. Instead, he accepted a position overseeing the new peace negotiations. His first meeting with Daniel Cross took place aboard a neutral station positioned between human and Imperial territory. When the two men finally stood face to face, neither spoke for several seconds. Daniel studied the alien general. "You look different without a detention uniform." Kale gave a faint smile. "You look different without a battlefield behind you." Daniel extended his hand. Kale looked at it for a moment before accepting it. "General, Admiral," Daniel said, "I still don't trust you completely." Kale nodded. "Good." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Good? Trust should be earned, not demanded." Daniel smiled slightly. "Then perhaps we can work with that." Outside the station, human and Imperial ships remained separated by thousands of kilometers. Their weapons were powered down, but their crews remained alert. Peace had begun, but nobody believed it was permanent. Too many wounds were still fresh. Too many people still remembered burning cities and destroyed ships. Yet something had changed. The Galactic Throne had finally turned its attention toward the warning it had ignored. Humanity had not conquered the Empire. The Empire had not destroyed humanity. Instead, both civilizations had reached the same conclusion from opposite directions. There were wars that could be won militarily but lost strategically, and there were enemies that became more dangerous the longer they were underestimated. Months later, the first returned human colony celebrated its independence beneath a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. Imperial soldiers withdrew quietly while human administrators returned. On another world, Imperial families watched their own ships return from the frontier, relieved that their sons and daughters would no longer be sent into a war that had never needed to happen. And aboard a small diplomatic vessel traveling between the two civilizations, Kale stood beside Daniel as they watched Earth appear through the observation window. Daniel asked, "Do you think the Empire will try again someday?" Kale was silent for several seconds. Empires always have people who believe they should try again. And what stops them? Kale looked at the blue planet. "Memory." Daniel nodded. "Then we should make sure nobody forgets." Kale smiled faintly. "Agreed." Behind them, the diplomatic vessel continued toward the first permanent human-Aurelian peace conference. There were still arguments ahead, borders to negotiate, prisoners to exchange, colonies to rebuild, and distrust that would take generations to disappear. The war was over, but peace would require its own kind of courage. And somewhere deep within the archives of the Galactic Throne, the original report written by General Kale Veyron was preserved exactly as he had submitted it months earlier. At the top were the words that had once been ignored by the most powerful ruler in the galaxy: "Leave humanity alone." The throne had turned a blind eye. The Empire had paid the price. Humanity had survived. And the greatest lesson of the war was not that humans were stronger than aliens. It was that humanity had refused to disappear long enough for an empire to discover the difference between conquering a world and winning a war.